Welcome, Campfire Crew. Let's get it on. The House in Mexico by Haven. My parents moved into their house in Mexico about 20 years ago. My mother made the move by herself, and my father stayed behind in Seattle, tying some loose ends together. I agreed to help my mom move and stay with her until my dad joined her, which was to happen in a span of about 2 or 3 months. My mom and I got to the house the day before the moving company was scheduled to arrive with all the furniture, and that gave my mom enough time to hire some much-needed help. That was the day we met Letty, who became my mom's housekeeper for the following 8 years. She was a godsend. She was hardworking, loyal, and knew just about everyone in the neighborhood. Letty helped us hire some men that helped us move all of the heavy furniture while we unpacked all the boxes. It took the 3 of us about a week of hard work to get everything put away, but finally we were sitting in the living room, exhausted but basking in the glory of our accomplishment. And that's when we started hearing noises coming from a home bar we had in the living area. This was a wooden bar like you see in taverns. It had 3 stools, wine bottle racks, shelves for wine glasses and stemware, and had drawers in the back for cocktail utensils, as well as a storage cabinet where we kept things like a blender, ice bucket, martini shakers, etc. Like I mentioned, everything was put away and in order. The first thing we thought was maybe a rat had gotten in, but we hadn't seen any evidence of rodents at the time. It was the only thing that made sense. Letty got up and was heading towards the bar when suddenly we heard growling coming from the storage cabinet. The wine glasses started shaking and clinking, and the cabinet doors started slamming. It literally sounded like 2 wild animals were fighting in there. I was so terrified, I couldn't even get up and run. I stayed there with my heart pounding, listening to my mother pray and scream. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We were too scared to check. Letty, being the brave one, grabbed a broom and opened both cabinet and drawer doors. Nothing came out. No animals, nothing. Everything was completely untouched. We got out of the house and headed for the nearest church. Letty knew the priest and was able to get him to go back with us to bless the house, and Mom and I slept in the same room for a few nights after that, too scared to be by ourselves. A few weeks later, my mom and Letty were digging in the front yard working on a flower bed when they came upon some jars. When they pulled them out, there were little rag dolls that had pins stuck to them and other things that they couldn't make out. They didn't open the jars, and Letty said she knew someone that would know how to dispose of them, so she took them with her. The place they were digging is directly on the other side of the wall where the bar is. I don't know if this finding had anything to do with the incident a few weeks before, but it's a big coincidence that the noises were coming so close to where these weird objects were found. Everything was quiet for a while, nothing out of the ordinary. Then, we hosted a party one day. I think it was just a housewarming. There were only a few guests left, mostly family, and it was around 3 a.m. Some people were sitting on the bar stools, and others were standing around the bar talking and drinking, when suddenly a mirror with a frame with the word bar around it that was hanging on the wall shattered. It didn't just crack, it shattered. Well, that was an immediate party pooper because everyone cleared out of there real fast. One other time, my mother was walking around at night before bed, securing doors and windows, and she had just made it back to her bedroom when she swears she heard glass breaking. She thought that all the wine and liquor bottles had fallen and shattered, but when she went to check, everything was in order. There was no broken glass. Upon inspection, she noticed one of the windows next to the bar was open, and this didn't scare her too much because there's bars on that window, so there's no way anyone can get in, even with the window open. But she swore she had checked the window a few minutes before, and it was closed. She thought that maybe someone had thrown a rock and shattered the glass, but there was no broken glass anywhere. She checked, and the window wasn't broken. It was just open, meaning someone had to slide it open. She said it was possible she missed seeing the window open, but What was the loud noise she heard, like dishes breaking? When she shared this with the family, we told her that maybe the noise was coming from the outside, and with the window open it sounded close. But she's very adamant that the sound came from inside. Another incident involving the home bar. I was randomly taking pictures of the house when I noticed something very strange was showing in a picture of the bar. One of the stools had a scary image. It looked like a devil with horns, and I showed the picture to my family, and they were all freaked out. My mom insisted that I delete the image from my camera. I never did, but the problem is I can't find that camera. I only take pictures with my phone now, but I am searching and searching until I find it. The image was very clear, it wasn't distorted, and you could see it without anyone telling you what to look for. Still, what I do have is a lot of pictures of family and friends sitting at the bar, and on a few of them you can see orbs. I never share those because of privacy and because orbs can mean just about anything, I guess. I've tried taking pictures of the bar with my phone, and I don't get anything anymore. The house has been quiet lately. I've done a lot of cleansings and blessings, and it will stay that way for a while, and then suddenly, for some unknown reason, it wakes up again. By the way, I found out later that Letty turned out to be a bruja, or witch. She showed me a lot of things that I cannot explain, and would like to know what you all think. More to come. Incident with a Creepy Neighbor When I Was Younger by Dave Pastrami Rubin. I wanted to share this pretty frightening story that happened to me back when I was about 12 years old. I was recently going through some of my old cringy notebooks and journals with my girlfriend and found my journal entry where I wrote about this day, and all the memories came flooding back to me. I used to live in what I thought was a really safe and secure private community. I wasn't allowed to just wander around too far from home without supervision, but because our neighborhood was a gated community, my parents let me walk around within the gates any time I wanted, even if they weren't home. One day, I was riding around the neighborhood after school when I saw a middle-aged woman crying on the floor of her porch with the front door wide open. Being concerned, I got off my bike to see what was wrong. She said she was having problems with her husband and immediately asked me to come in so I could keep her company while she calmed down. My stranger danger sirens were going off, so I declined, but she kept pushing me. Please, just for a moment. I just need someone to talk to," she said. Now, I was raised to always respect elders and be a good person, but also raised with the aforementioned stranger danger. So, being a young, naive kid, I actually felt pretty conflicted about whether I should go in or not. Ultimately, I declined repeatedly enough that she instead asked me to at least wait outside with her and sit with her until she felt better. I agreed to this since I felt very safe in my neighborhood. She asked me to wait on the porch for her while she walked into the house and visibly grabbed a couple framed pictures from off the wall. She then sat down next to me inside the house while I was sitting on the porch just outside her door, and she started showing me these pictures. One was of a kid older than me in the local high school football uniform, and the other of a man and the same kid. She started telling me about how this was her kid and her husband. She went on to say these stories of how she met him and how they spent their honeymoon in Hawaii and how her kid was so good at football, one of the best on his team. She was worried that if she and her husband got a divorce, she wouldn't be able to see her kid anymore, and she started bawling again, this time onto my shoulder. This actually caused me to let my guard down quite a bit. Once I knew she had a kid, I felt more comfortable around her for some reason. She was talking for a while, though, and I was beginning to start to feel a little awkward as she went on and off crying on my shoulder, and I didn't really know how to react in the situation. What the hell have I gotten myself into? I kept thinking to myself as I nodded my head, pretending to listen. I was more concerned about finding a good excuse to tell her I had to go home, and she kept calling me such a nice young boy and telling me, "You have no idea how important it is for you to spend time with me," which made me feel a little bad about just leaving her. She kept telling me she wanted to reward me and make me some dinner if I just came in, which I continued to decline. At this point, mostly because I wanted to leave more than actually being afraid. Finally, I told her I had to go, and she asked if I knew anything about how to turn on her cell phone, as she just got her first one recently. I told her I did and could help her out before I left, and she told me to wait again, and this time I was waiting for quite a while. I kept thinking I should just walk away, but part of me didn't want to be rude, especially since she lived around the corner from my house and possibly even knew my parents. My anxiety levels would spike as I got closer and closer in my head to convincing myself to just stand up and walk away. And then it would dissipate, and I'd tell myself, No, you just can't leave. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she brought me her Android phone. I only had an iPhone 3G at the time, and it was my first smartphone, so I was a little worried I wouldn't know how it worked. I just held the power button down for a second, and lo and behold, it booted right up. She asked me then if I knew how to check text messages. I found and opened up the Messages app, and there was only one number, not saved as a contact in the app, when she pointed to it and said, "That's the bastard. That's my husband's number. Can you read me his texts?" I opened it up. She had received basically the same text over and over again, just variations on, "Hello?" and "Please respond." She angrily said, "Read them to me right now. I want to know what he said to me." I looked at her and told her they basically all say the same hello with a question mark. She just reaffirmed in a stern voice, "Read them to me." I started reading them. "Hello? Hello? Please respond." She just sat there with her eyes closed and was nodding sometimes, commenting with things along the line of, "That asshole," or "He does miss me," or "Well, fuck him, he had his chance." She turned quickly from this crying, distraught woman who was worried about her husband would leave her into an angry and spiteful person who felt like she was in the right. When I stopped reading a couple of times and asked if she wanted me to stop, she would snap at me to keep reading, and I would continue. I started to feel like her husband was a crazy person with this many messages, and I must have scrolled and read dozens of messages, almost identical, spanning back days. My heart was racing. I felt like I was involved in something I shouldn't be involved in, and I really wanted to go home. But every time I stopped, she would get really angry and tell me to keep going. That's when I came across the first message that wasn't hello. "Stop messaging me, you crazy bitch, and leave me alone. I've reported you to the police and gotten a restraining order. If you come anywhere near my family, you will be arrested." My heart sank. That's when I realized all the messages I had been reading so far were being sent from her phone. I paused in shock, and she again snapped at me, "Keep reading." I told her I couldn't because it was getting late, and my parents had dinner waiting for me. She again said, "Why don't you just come in for dinner? I'll make you something. You can let them know later you were helping your neighbor. They won't be mad, I promise." Only this time when she said it, she was a mixture of angry and desperate. I told her they would be worried and probably wondering why I was gone for so long. She pleaded a couple of more times for me to not leave her, and she started crying as soon as I stood up. Honestly, I really felt bad about it at the time. I rode my bike home as quickly as I could. My parents had just gotten home from work a little while before, and they asked me where I was. I didn't tell them the truth because, honestly, I was worried they wouldn't let me hang out around the neighborhood when they weren't home anymore if they knew the truth. A few days later, I came home, and there were 3 police cars in front of the house. My heart sank. I asked my parents later that night if they knew what had happened, and my dad said, "Oh, there was just a break-in or something." I later asked one of my neighbors to see if I could get more information. Apparently, one of my neighbors fell in love with a homeless woman after inviting her in for a shower and a place to stay. He got her new clothes and a phone and was trying to help her get a job, but it turns out the reason she was homeless was because she suffered from mental illness, and he kicked her out when she started having delusions of his kid from a previous marriage being her kid as well. And honestly, he sounded like a real asshole, but she began harassing him after this, so he left the house and went to his parents' house and sent his kid to the ex-wife's house because he was worried for his kid and his kid's safety. He had every right to, because shortly after he left, she broke a rear window of his house and came in. She had been living there for nearly a week before a neighbor noticed the broken window and called the police. She apparently trashed the whole house by that point and was arrested. I almost didn't believe it, but actually went and looked behind the house and saw the broken window. I guess the guy broke his lease and moved out immediately because he was worried she would come back after getting out of jail. I don't know if she ever did try to come back, but I hope they disclosed all of this to the new tenants. Honestly, I still get pretty freaked out to this day about what could have happened if I had gone into that house. The Black-Eyed Child. I'd be lying if I told you I didn't know about black-eyed kids before this happened to me late summer last year. I definitely did. Now, in the moment, that idea never crossed my mind, but afterward, hell yes. And the thought leads to all kinds of regret I realize is stupid, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about my neighborhood. I live in a poor part of town, a bit ghetto, a bit of the barrio, a bit of the lower economic class of a cross-section of races. It's L.A. The apartment complex spans a short block. It's dusty brown like the desert we live in. It's got 2 pools, lots of little Mexican children, and for the most part, a pretty friendly population. I'm a destitute writer trying to make it in Hollywood, so I spend my free time writing. When this happened, I was working mostly in the mornings and afternoons. I would get home, hit the gym, and then settle in for an evening in front of the computer. It's pretty common for the evenings in the summer to be chaotic around our apartment complex. Kids playing in the pool, the ice cream man pushing his cart up and down the sidewalk, women talking outside the laundry room. Hey, I do my own laundry, but I'm pretty much the only guy I see here doing it. Anyway, you know, nice. Low income, but pleasant. Like a mixed-race, 21st century version of a 50s sitcom. And people will always knock on your door, sometimes to borrow something. I cook, so neighbors pop by to find out the origins of the great aromas wafting from my kitchen window, and also sometimes for a little help working on a broken-down car. But mostly, it's kids selling candy bars or Christmas wrapping paper, or jittery tweakers selling magazine subscriptions, or even old Mexican men selling bootleg DVDs, and, of course, lots of Jehovah's Witnesses. Because it's hot out, I leave my windows open. AC isn't cheap, and I've got no money, remember? I was just hoping for a cross breeze. That means, though, I can't see anyone from where I sit and work, but I can hear them very clearly as they walk up to my door. When I hear someone knock, I answer it. Besides the occasional candy bar, I smile, politely decline, wish them a nice day, and send them off. No big deal. That evening it was quiet, which was strange in and of itself. I should at least have been able to hear the distant sound of ranchero music. I heard a couple of people walk up to my door, and I'm not the first apartment in my courtyard, so usually I hear the salespeople as they knock on my neighbors' doors and work their way around to me. Not this time. Whoever it was walked right up to my door and knocked. I got up to answer it, reaching for the door handle, when a chill went through my body like I have never experienced. A cold tightness in my chest. I halted my hand movement towards the door handle and placed it flat on the door as if I was feeling for heat from a fire. I have a peephole on my door, but it never crossed my mind to use it. I just stood there with my hand flat on the door listening. And they knocked again. I don't scare easy, and I wasn't exactly afraid, but I was having a visceral experience all over my body. A base fear reaction. Just like I could hear them, they had heard me move to the door. They knew I was inside. "Yes," I said. "Who is it?" A boy's voice answered.
"We need to use your phone."
Yeah, that's not going to happen, I said and started laughing. I stress laughed when I'm in pain or under pressure. They heard me laughing, and neither of us moved for about a minute or two. A really, really long minute or two. Finally, they walked away. Not to any of the other 8 doorways within 15 feet. Not to ask anyone else. Before they could have gone more than a dozen yards, curiosity reasserted itself, and I yanked the door open, running after them to see who it was and where they were headed. The courtyard of my complex was completely empty. Afterwards, I thought the experience fit the stories about black-eyed kids, and I kicked myself for not opening the door. Coming face to face with the BEKs? How cool would that have been? But then I remember that feeling, my skin crawling, and the certain knowledge in me at that moment, there was no way in hell I was opening that door. I believe it's Bigfoot. These incidents have occurred over a period of approximately 7 years. The occurrences have not been limited to a particular time of year. I have never, nor has any in our group, sighted a creature. Most have experienced hearing knocks, loud branch breaks, hearing bipedal footsteps emanating from a much larger creature than a human would make, smelling noxious odors, and having that inexplicable feeling of being watched. The place is a cabin which has been in my son-in-law's family for 4 generations. It's located on the edge of the Allegheny National Forest, off the summit of a mountain. Across the lane from the cabin is a large meadow belonging to a local doctor. This is sometimes planted in grain crops, other times allowed to remain fallow. There are other cabins scattered along the lane, but none within eyesight of the other. My first trip there was in October of 2006. There was no other activity at the other camps, but my son-in-law Eric and I arrived at about 8 or 8:30 at night in the darkness. Upon exiting our Jeep, I had an immediate feeling of being watched. I've spent a good deal of time in the woods, hunting, fishing, and hiking, and I'm not easily spooked. After dinner, cleaning up and sitting up a bit, we turned in at about midnight. Around 2 a.m., I was awoken by the sound of an old wooden table and chairs being pushed about on the deck. We determined it must be a bear and went back to sleep, but approximately 2 hours later, we heard something rustling about the fire pit. We did not cook any food outdoors, and we brought in all our empty bottles and such when we came in to discourage bears and other critters. In the morning, we found the table and chairs had been moved about, which a bear or even a large raccoon could have done. However, the fire pit had been scattered about, some of the smoldering logs rolled aside. Another time, we were hunting in the forest behind the cabin. The topography is typical Appalachian mountain, rugged, steep slopes, ravines, small streams, and bogs. Here and there are small oil seeps as well, and we had just descended into a fairly open area, which promised grouse. This was early November, crisp but not cold. We were each carrying shotguns loaded with upland game shells, and we were walking approximately 50 yards apart, when we stopped, looked at one another, and asked, "What is that smell?" From out of nowhere came the most putrid, overpowering smell. It was not the oil seeps, which have their own sulfur-like smell. This was horrid. It was like a skunk on steroids, with a good measure of open septic tank, and some rotten garbage added for good measure. We continued on our way, and the smell dissipated after about 100 feet. We tried to tell one another it was a dead deer or something, but we both knew better. I worked in a funeral home while in college, and have never experienced anything that nauseating. We also had an unnerving feeling of being watched the entire time we were there. Upon relating the above to my daughter, Eric's wife, she stated that she had smelled awful odors for no apparent reason as well, and felt like she was being watched several times. We've heard howls far in the distance, and others within a quarter mile or so of the cabin. There are coyotes in this area, yet these wails were much longer in duration and have more range. Some start low and rise towards nearly a falsetto pitch. Others have been more monotone, yet will waver somewhat. Even others will start low and culminate in a scream, and this is not a bobcat, not a coyote, and all members of our party were accounted for. In March of 2014, a group of us went for a spring opening. There were 5 of us there, and as darkness set in, I decided to venture out to the open meadow to observe the winter constellations. This was about 100 yards from the cabin, which was situated on the downward slope from the summit, which is the meadow. The area behind and on both sides of the cabin is a fairly steep slope. It is heavily grown with second-growth trees, brush, and scrub. There are also a lot of blowdown branches, which makes walking even in daylight difficult. At night, it is an invitation for a sprained ankle at best. As I was observing the stars and enjoying the silence, I heard footsteps. Not in the trail, not in the meadow, but coming up the slope to the south of the cabin. My initial thought was a bear. As I listened, it was apparent the footfalls were from a biped. I called out if it was any of our group and received no reply. Then the steps would start again. I called again, louder, and the steps stopped for a moment. Then they began again, finally stopping by the edge of the lane. There were no lights showing. The moon was in the final phase of its final quarter and just a sliver. I decided to return to the cabin. I was about 20 yards from where I heard the steps stop along the edge of the lane. As I drew parallel to that area, I heard shuffling under the underbrush, as if whatever it was had turned its entire body sideways to watch me pass. When I entered the cabin, everyone was where I had left them. There were no new leaves, smuttered debris in the doorway, and when I asked if they had heard anything, they all said no. They were watching Planes, Trains, and Automobiles on VHS. Finally, this past spring, a group of us went up for a weekend. While sitting about the rear deck, enjoying a fire and talking, a member of our party was encouraged to do their howl. And they did it, and about 30 seconds later, the sound of a very large tree limb snapping came from down the slope behind the cabin. Could it have been a bear stepping on a branch? Perhaps, but that would be very coincidental to step on a limb just after a howl. I know there is something in those mountains. I can't prove it, but it's one of those things that you know that you know. Right Behind Me by Imogen45. Over the summer when I was younger, I decided to go visit my cousins in Los Angeles. We had just gotten back from the pier, where I didn't have any fun at all since both of my cousins didn't want to be there and kept talking behind my back. The 3 of us were walking up a steep hill which led to a busy street with a stoplight and a corner that led to the restaurant my aunt was waiting for us. As we were walking, my younger cousin Alan, who was 12 at the time, was talking to his older sister Yana, who was 14 at the time and the same age as me. He kept on talking in a very loud voice about this guy who was walking in the opposite direction of us, across from where we were walking. He was of medium height, wore black, pink, and white camo pants that matched the pink shirt he was wearing. He had dreadlocks and wore a hat and sunglasses. Apparently, Alan thought the man looked weird or something and started to laugh mockingly at him. As he was laughing, the man stopped and looked over at him, and suddenly Yana pulled Alan down in front of me and hid behind a car. In my mind at the time, I thought it was incredibly stupid to be hiding from this guy in plain sight, so I started to talk to them like they were just joking around with me. All they did was ignore me, and kept peeking out from behind the car to make sure the man went away. After about 2 or 3 minutes went by, they got up from behind the car and kept walking. We were about to pass a stop sign when I noticed both of my cousins running away from me. I didn't think anything suspicious was going on since I knew my cousins were very athletic and would sometime like to run for no apparent reason. For me, on the other hand, I didn't, and I still don't consider myself as an athletic person. I also had breathing problems at the time, which were mildly acting up from the hill being so steep. I tried yelling at them to stop running so I could catch up, but they kept on ignoring me, saying that they were going to be late for the reservations. Later on, knowing that the restaurant we went to was the type where you would walk up to the window to order, meaning there was no way that you would ever need a reservation. By the time I tried yelling back at them, they already turned the corner that led to where the restaurant was. This hill was killing me, and when I finally made my way up to where they turned, I was relieved. I looked in the distance about 40 or 50 feet away to see my aunt, cousins, and their little Pomeranian waiting for me at the restaurant. As I walked on, I kept looking at the pavement, trying to avoid any eye contact with people walking by me. The streets were obviously very busy, being that it was LA, and also being near a beach. While looking at the pavement, I would momentarily look ahead of me to see how far I was from where my aunt was standing. I was close enough to see their faces, but I could notice that the look on my aunt's face looked confused, and she was seemingly staring beside me more than at me. That's when I noticed some sort of tingling sound, almost like a small bell. At first I thought it was the sound of a bell and a dog collar, and someone was walking behind me. The sound kept on getting closer and closer, almost like it was about to pass me, and I remember switching my gaze from the sidewalk in front of me to beside me, waiting to see the dog trotting its way towards me. The bell sound kept on getting louder, and I basically felt the presence of someone right behind me. Whoever this person was kept on walking faster and faster, which made me start to pick up my pace. At this point, I was already about 5 or 10 feet away from the restaurant, seeing my cousins and aunt basically standing right in front of me. I started to make a little sprint towards them, and then I stopped abruptly. That's when I felt the breeze of someone passing by me at a very fast pace. It didn't take me long to realize it was the same guy that Alan was yelling at a few minutes before. I also realized the tingling bell sound I heard was obviously not of a dog, but the keys that were strapped to his pants. My aunt told me that he was walking almost right beside me, as if we knew each other. Girls Like Me by Thrownaway Story 9. This didn't happen in the U.S. I was 16 and in high school, and it was also my last year in that school since it was closing and barely had any students left. I was a naive girl, and it happened almost around 7 years ago. We had a heavy rotation of teachers for the language classes we chose between two. I chose English because I already had classes apart from high school. Our class only had 4 students because most of them chose the other language. The new teacher was a man in his 60s. He was from our country but spent years working with a certain government of matters he did not speak of. He told us he was married to a lovely woman at least 35 years younger, and he had 2 kids with her. We even saw the pictures. He also had this weird sexist male pride, so when he wasn't bragging about his trophy wife, he was raving about macho culture. I can't remember him teaching at all. I do recall this moment, though. Him describing how thrilled he was when he first saw a porn movie in a theater. He even described entire scenes as we just sat there petrified. I even remember the name of the movie, and sometimes one of us would miss class and the others would feel super anxious, because that meant we had to sit closer to him. Now that I live abroad, I realized that I had a few teachers being inappropriate with me, which is odd considering I was introverted and slightly tomboyish. I wasn't womanly looking, and we all had the same baggy uniform. But this guy would greet me every time with a big smile. When it was time for class, he stood by the door as we entered, and I remember he hugged me at least once. Fast forward to the day that this happened. It was all relatively normal. I did well in biology class and got some extra points that I required, which is relevant to this story. It was around lunchtime when I sat alone at a small spiral staircase under the teacher's room, and the school was practically empty. This English teacher showed up, and I think he wanted to go upstairs, so I greeted him and tried to get out of his way. As he went up, he held both my arms and just stood there, staring at me. Everything from this is like a puzzle with missing pieces in my memory. I swear I recall him grabbing my face around my chin, although I don't have an exact memory. And he whispered things I couldn't really hear. My mind was racing, and I just wanted to leave. He kissed my cheek about a centimeter away from my mouth, and I froze. Then he said what I'll never forget. You have no idea what girls like you do to men." He kept repeating it like a psycho while still holding me and not letting me go. Then I swear he was going to kiss me, and suddenly this loud voice came from upstairs talking about my extra points. It was my biology teacher, and there was a quick conversation between the two of them, and I decided to follow my biology teacher to escape. I never saw that English teacher again. What he said made me feel disgusted, and it never left my memory, and sometimes it makes me hate myself. I have periods where I try as much as possible to erase whatever it is to satisfy these people. I had nothing other than innocence, and it makes me feel sick. I had bad things happen to me after that period simply because I thought I didn't have a voice, and that my worth was tied to my appearance, or whatever it is, because I am not that person. I only realized that this specific memory bothered me so much until recently. I could never point a finger to why this kept going back to my mind, but I'm sure I tried to forget some of the things he did. I never told my parents or the principal. It was something about the teacher situation. The reason why we had a heavy rotation of teachers is because the owner principal was going bankrupt, and he couldn't pay his teachers normally. He was also at least 70 years old, and he lived in that same foreign place many years before, just like the English teacher. When I look back, I don't really think he was an English teacher at all. What Happened Out There? Submitted by Old and Slow. I was an ECO in a state I'm not going to mention back in the 70s, and this is a story that happened to me and my partner Joe one day in evening during shotgun season one year. Obviously, part of our duties was to check doe tags and that sort of thing, and we knew about some repeat offenders that always tried to pull fast ones. That's not what happened in this particular case, but you'll figure that out soon. And I'm paraphrasing some of the dialogue in storytelling fashion. Please bear with me. Bill, I'll call him, was notorious for getting doe tags in other people's names and using fake ID to match what he was doing. Despite being fined multiple times, he would move around a lot and fool plenty of people before being caught once again. Joe and I were making some rounds one afternoon in season, and as the day wore on, we saw fewer and fewer hunters, as most of them were wrapping things up before darkness fell and shooting hours were over. Out of nowhere, Bill comes up to the small crowd of people we were talking to, and he recognized us, and immediately we saw that something was wrong. For one thing, he had blood on his clothes and a streak on his face, which the rest of was white as a sheet. Before anyone else noticed him, Joe and I led him away from the group and behind our truck. He was shaking and his eyes were crazy, darting all over the place and not focusing on any one thing for too long. At first we thought maybe he was high, but he wasn't. "Bill, what's going on? Did you have trouble gutting a doe or something?" asked Joe. Bill snapped his head to Joe with his crazy eyes and just stared for a minute. Then he violently shook his head and said, No, man, no." "Well, then what's up? Where'd all this blood come from?" I asked, pointing at his overalls that were stained to brownish red. "There's something out there," he said, jerking his thumb behind him. "I don't know what, but you need to see it. I can't explain it. Just please come with me." He was pleading with us, and I looked at Joe. He went over to our truck, radioed what we were doing, and then came back. "Lead on, McDuff," he said, and Bill nodded. But before we left, I grabbed 2 flashlights from the truck as it was getting darker by the minute. No one noticed us leaving the little parking area, and there were no cars or trucks in the direction we were walking. When we got to the edge of the woods, I spoke up. "Okay, Bill, no one's around. What's going on here?" I wasn't trying to push him, but this was really odd, and if there was something we needed to know, I wanted to know right that minute. "Okay, but you guys are going to think I'm crazy until you see it. And by the way, all I got are legit tags this year, but you can see that when we get to the..." And he kind of trailed off for a second as we walked. And then he went on. "I came out by myself this year. The kid wasn't interested for some reason, and none of my buddies could hunt today, but I was all set to go. So I set out like I always do and head to our stand. You guys know the one. It's the same one we all built and have been using for the last few years. I nodded even though he couldn't see me as I was walking behind him. Joe and I were familiar with the stand he was talking about, a plywood contraption that I was always amazed held up 3 grown men. I mean, some hunters go all out. These guys cut every corner they could. He went on. So I got out here well before dawn with my thermos and stuff, ready to stay as long as it took to get a doe, and everything was fine. Not a care in the world, just thoughts on the hunt. I got to our stand, I grabbed a 5-gallon bucket on the ground, carried it up, and then settled in for some quiet and hopefully my deer. But things weren't happening, and after a few hours the sun was up and everything was just quiet. There's another stand not too far away from ours, maybe 3/4 of a mile away, you guys probably know, and I thought I'd go over and see how they were making out if anyone was there at all. So I climbed down and started my walk, and things were fine, just no deer. At this point we reached his stand, and it looked the way he left it. We stopped and Joe climbed up and he came down and said nothing out of the ordinary, just the 5-gallon bucket Bill mentioned. I nodded to Bill and he started moving again and kept talking. Well, I got almost to the other stand and I could sort of make it out through the trees, but I noticed something funny. The woods were dead quiet. I stopped and listened, and there was nothing to hear. I mean, no wind, no critters, no sounds at all. I thought, man, this is weird, but I kept pushing on towards the stand, and I gave out a call hoping that someone was not lining up a shot and I just blew it for them. But at the same time, I didn't need my butt blown off either, so I didn't really mind yelling out. There was no response, so I just kept on walking, and right before I got to the foot of the stand, I noticed something else. The blood. There's blood on the leaves all over, and even some on the tree trunks. I mean, there's blood everywhere, you're going to see. So I'm wondering if someone's in trouble, because a shot deer wouldn't have let out this much blood. I mean, no way, no how, and it wouldn't have been splashed all over the place. I kept moving, got to the stand, and I saw blood on the ladder rungs. I shouted up to see if everything was okay, but no one answered. So I look around, and that's when I see this hat on the ground about 10 feet away. I walked over to it and saw that it was bloody too, and now I really knew something isn't right, and I figured I'd better come find you guys. But then I saw an orange vest about 20 feet farther away, and I got closer to that, and there was blood all over that too. So I called out again, asking if anyone is hurt or needed help, but again there was no answer, just that quiet. Now I'm scared, right? I'm looking down and around to see if I've walked in any of this mess, and then I heard this deep, low rumble. Bill suddenly stopped and looked around like he was listening for something, and I almost ran into him. Well, what was it? I asked after a minute. I don't know, he said. It wasn't an animal, I can tell you that. It was like a person trying to growl like an animal. He started walking again, but he didn't say anything else, and I looked at Joe after poking his arm and gave him a Bill's off his rocker face. I look up, and we're almost to the other stand. I can see it the way Bill described it. About 100 yards away, I tell Bill to stay where we were, and Joe and I would go check things out. We didn't need him getting any closer. The two of us cautiously walked over to the tree stand and saw what Bill was talking about. There was blood on the ground and tree trunks, as well as on the ladder. Of course, we didn't touch it, but we still needed to look inside the stand to see if anyone was in there. So I stepped up to the other side of it and saw that if Joe gave me a foot boost, I'd be able to pull myself up and look in. So up I went, and when my hands grabbed the little sill and I stuck my head in a little bit, I was back on the ground awfully quick. And that was after I yelled out and pushed away from the stand. I fell right on my back and I had the wind knocked out of me, and Joe was standing over me asking over and over, "What? What is it? What's going on?" It took a minute or so for me to get my breath back, but Joe said I was as pale as a ghost, and I could feel my arms shaking. Never in my life had I felt this way, on the job or otherwise. I looked at Joe and said, "We need to get somebody else out here right now. This one is way above our pay grade." He just stared at me and I said, "I think there's a body in there, but I can't be sure." more staring from Joe. What I saw will never leave me. In fact, the only other horrific things I've seen in my life that were almost as bad as this came from my 2 tours in Vietnam and the death and destruction war creates and leaves behind. I've seen a lot of dead people, mutilated women and children, but this was worse. What scared me then and scares me now is, at the time, I couldn't say for sure a body was in that tree stand. When I looked in, I saw what looked like a pair of legs and hips with no abdomen or chest lying on the floor of the stand. Blood had splashed all of the walls, and one arm was propped up in a corner. It looked like some kind of giant pair of pliers or something took a massive chunk out of a body, taking with it most of its upper body. There was a clump of hair right by my left hand on the sill, and what was either teeth or fingernails sitting on top of it in a pool of blood. Joe helped me up, and we looked around for the other stuff Bill said he saw, and soon we found the hat, and a little farther along, a child's down jacket and that orange vest. All of it was bloody, and we looked in the direction things seemed to be heading. Joe took 2 large sticks, staked them in the ground near the objects, and I ripped a handkerchief in half and tied a piece on each stick so they'd be identifiable. It was getting dark, and we flicked on our lights, and we looked up, and Bill was walking towards us, and we told him to stop and go back as we moved towards him. I mean, he had a million questions, and I understand that, but all I could say was, "Bill, I don't know, Bill." The 3 of us double-timed it back to the staging area where we were parked, and I got on the radio to call it in. Less than half an hour later, the area was teeming with state police and county sheriffs. We told Bill he was going to need to speak to a lieutenant that had identified us as such, and he went away with some troopers. Joe and I were also questioned about what was going on, and we repeated everything that had happened, and everything that Bill had told us, too. By now it was dark. We got other flashlights as ours were dying, and we led a team of about 10 men back to the tree stand, including some investigators and detectives. Nothing had changed since we left, and all of them looked around with the same reactions we had. There was a smear on a rung of the ladder, and that's where Bill had slipped and wiped his face, and that's why he had blood on his kisser. One of the detectives accessed the stand via the window, and all I heard him say was, "Holy Mary, Mother of God." 5 of us were sent out to follow the blood trail to see what else we could find, which was not easy in the dark. A couple 100 yards away there was a gut pile, but not a deer pile. This was human guts, part of the intestine strung up on a sapling. I had to bite down to not puke, and there were a whole bunch of "Jesus Christ" and "What the hell did this" going around. Again, things were marked off, and we kept going to the edge of a ravine with a creek at the bottom. The drops and smears of blood were almost non-existent at this point, and the last thing we or anyone else found was a bloody shotgun sitting inches away from the cliff edge that dropped down maybe 70 feet or so. There wasn't much else Joe and I could do at this point after verifying our story and radio calls, so we kind of hung back and let the detectives do their thing while we went back to the truck. Our supervisor was there waiting for us, and a couple walled tent and stove units had been put up in the parking area. The other hunters had been cleared out long ago, and the boss told us the area and road was going to be restricted until further notice. We sat down on 2 chairs in one of the tents with Ron, our supervisor, and the lieutenant from the troopers to go over everything again with another trooper recording it all. We turned our gloves and boots over just to make sure that if we got into anything it could be marked for further investigation. I learned that Bill had been taken to a barracks for holding as things got sorted out, and it struck me as odd that in all of this, we never once thought he could be involved in everything that we found. We ended up being right, but because he had been out there alone and had blood all over him, he had to be considered someone of interest. Joe and me had to talk to investigators a lot in the following weeks, and we had been put on paid leave right after all of this for whatever reason. It was a good job, and you don't fight the powers that be when they make these decisions. So, what happened out there? That's the most messed up. No one knows just exactly what happened. We both did a lot of phone calling and snooping around to get a better idea of what happened, and a lot of what we found was disturbing, even though we never heard the whole story. There had been parts of 2 bodies in that tree stand, but there was blood from 3. The testing was rock solid. 2 bodies, but 3 different types of blood. The other odd thing, there was no way a third person could have gotten into that tree stand. It just wasn't big enough. Searchers who went down into the ravine found more blood on some rocks, and even more gruesome, a foot split down the middle. Obviously, we couldn't have seen it from the top of the ravine, but they found it pretty clear. The foot wasn't hacked, but it was split like a surgeon, one smooth, clean cut right between the toes down to the heel. I saw pictures of it later, and was frightened how clean it was. Now here's the strangest part. No whole bodies were ever recovered, and the investigators were certain everything had happened the day Bill stumbled onto it and took us out there. Also, no one reported anyone missing in the state, or surrounding states for that matter. The owners of the tree stand hadn't been out at all that season, and all of them had alibis for where they were in the days leading up to and the day of the occurrence. There was nothing for anyone to go on. Just surgical-like precise marks on what body parts were found and separated from whatever bodies they came from. 2 males and a female. Joe and I never saw or heard from Bill again, but we did hear that it was possible he moved to California a few years after this incident. I retired in 2006 after 35 years in the field, and now live in Florida. Joe still lives back where we worked, and we talk from time to time, and he's told me the case is still open, though long, long cold. Neither of us really pursue it anymore. But that happened so many, many years ago. Something or someone did a horrible act out in those woods and left nothing for anyone to really search for. I couldn't say what happened on that fall day, but the aftermath sure has a spot in my mind and my nightmares. Never after that did I see such a violent scene in the forest. Like I said, what happened in Vietnam was one thing, and that was so horrible I don't talk about that much, and would never want anyone to see what I saw overseas. But this was hands down 10 times worse, if that makes sense. I've resigned myself to never knowing what happened out there, and to be honest, deep down, I don't think I really want to know. After the Arrest by Arisen925. So this happened about 7 years ago. I had to be 15 or 16. My cousin had been convicted of robbing a Taco Bell, a Chinese restaurant, and a couple of other food places. I'd been visiting my family when he was arrested, but we had just got there the very same night that he was officially arrested. My aunt, not his mom, and we'll call her Aunt Number 1, at the time owned a really nice house where my cousin was last seen by the police because he had come over to do his laundry. We were staying at this aunt's house for the time that we were visiting. Nothing unusual happened for the first few nights, but Aunt Number 1's house is just creepy because of how big it is. Literally, the whole front of the house is covered in giant-ass windows, and you can see the whole street where she lives on from these windows, so it's really kind of hard to sleep. Fast forward to about a week, and shit started to get weird. The first thing that when my other cousin, the cousins who got arrested sister, we'll call her B, she and I went to a movie late at night. We noticed that when we had left the movie theater, a car had been following us since the end of the movie, after we had left the movie theater. We didn't think anything of it and just shrugged it off merely as coincidence. But by the time we had gotten to my Aunt Number 1's house to drop me off where my family was staying, we noticed the car was still behind us. B freaked out a little and decided to turn around to make sure the car didn't know where my Aunt Number 1 lived, and drove us to the police station. When we got there, the car immediately turned around and went away. Being the dumbass 16-year-old and 18-year-old that we were, we decided to follow that shit. So we fly down the road to try to find this car, and guess what? It's heading toward my fucking Aunt Number 1's house. Legit, in the exact same rich-ass neighborhood. That was no coincidence. So we pulled up to my aunt's house where he pulled up, and this guy got out of the car and charges our car saying, "Why the fuck are you following me? I'm calling the cops on you. You're lucky I don't beat the shit out of you. Keep in mind, B is a 110-pound blonde girl, and I'm a 6'2" fat teenager at the time. This guy is 6'4", jacked, and the next thing you know, my mom sees us outside, and she comes running over. I mean flying the fuck over. My mom is terrifying for a 120-pound Midwestern lady, and she got right in this guy's face. I think she threatened a lawsuit like a classic white woman would do, and the guy backed off and said that it was all a misunderstanding. Anyway, we told my mom what happened, and this is when shit really started to get weird. My aunt's house has 2 front doors, so there's a door, then a little room where the front door is to that room. It's an old house, and I think that this was used as an intercom room to buzz people in or whatever. For the next few nights, we heard knocks coming from the front door. We would answer, but no one would be there, except one night while I was away at a friend's house, and Aunt number 1 and my mom were the only ones in that house. The door knocks came again, but this time shit was weird. For one, it was 2 a.m., and for 2, there were voices coming from the room in between the front door and the house. My mom and aunt refused to open the door, so they called my uncle, who was married to my aunt at the time but was away for business. Now my aunt was constantly sick and was just in constant pain over this, so my uncle told my mom to go to his safe and grab the shotgun, and then prop my aunt on the stairs that were facing the door with the gun, and says aim for their feet. My mom is a liberal-ass motherfucker from California, and the only guns we've ever shot are Nerf guns, so this was all new to her. But she did what he said, and eventually they heard whoever was out there leave, and a couple of cars start up and drive away. Nothing really happened after that, and we still talk about how weird that was to this day. But to the strangers that were keeping tabs on us, I actually kind of hope we do meet, because I'm still confused. And also, I've lost a lot of weight, so you'd be proud of me. Scary Evening by Nalchin. Please bear with me, as English is not my first language. If you knew who I was, you could very well figure out by now that I was not away from supernatural elements in my life. Life is always busy when it comes to having 2 kids, a lovely wife, well-paying job. I mean, what else can you really ask for? But the reason I'm writing this today is because something happened the day before yesterday, and I'm clueless. My oldest kid was busy with her homework after work, and I was helping my youngest son to draw on his scribble pad. Well, you need kids to be occupied, parents know that, or else they can bring the whole roof down. My wife was in the kitchen making our dinner, and it was a pleasant evening until we were done with our respective duties and then sat down for dinner. My house is located in one of the busiest parts of the city, and you can always hear the cars and motorbikes honking. It's not the ideal neighborhood, but I've got no complaints until that night. It was unusually quiet outside, and I had just put some curry on the plates for my kids and wife, and we all started to eat. Within a minute, I heard a loud thundering noise outside our door, and it was as if someone hit the door with a hammer. We were all shocked, as there's a bell outside and no one ever really knocks on the door. I asked everybody to stay seated, and I went to check on the door, and when I opened it, no one was there. There are just 2 apartments on our floor, including mine, and the other apartment is diagonally opposite from where we live, and it was locked from the outside. I then thought maybe the noise came from something close by or maybe on the floor below us. I went back to the table and continued dinner when we heard a loud cry from outside, like a woman yelling at the top of her voice. Again, I went out to check and found nothing. Then I went to the floor below us and checked with them if they heard someone yell, and they said no. I was starting to get worked up, and I went to the main entrance to check with the security guards to see if they had heard something. Their answer was also no. Having gotten worried about it, I was going back home in the elevator, and when I got out on my floor, I had a sudden hunch. Maybe the noise came from the apartment opposite mine. I went over to the apartment and knocked on the door. I knew the door would be locked, but I wanted to see if anyone was inside, but there was no response, so I hesitantly rang the bell. At that exact moment, my wife came running out from my apartment, and she said she saw something in our bathroom, and she seemed really restless, so I asked her to get the kids and lock herself in their room. I grabbed a hockey stick and slowly entered the room, and it was very cold. I got to admit, I was getting scared from my previous experiences that I've had in the paranormal, but then I saw that the air conditioner was on, so I turned it off and then opened the bathroom. No one was there. I turned back and left the lights on and went out of the room, and that's when I felt something on my lower neck, like a hot breath. I didn't panic. I thought maybe it was in my mind playing tricks along with the situation I was going through, but I still was scared. I turned around and found no one there, but the sense of someone around me was very, very strong. Nevertheless, I didn't want my kids and wife to panic, so I calmly went to the kids' room and told them that no one was there and they could sleep peacefully. I asked my wife to sleep inside my kids' room that night, and I said I'd be outside in the living room if they needed me. So while they went to bed, I sat on the sofa while they slept. The next morning, I went to my bedroom to change my clothes and found that the clothes inside the cupboard were all a mess. I didn't say anything to my wife about it. I just folded them back up and started my day. My wife and kids came out around 10 a.m. My wife looked very tired, and I guess the kids had given her a tough time all night. By noon, we had a very foul smell in our apartment. Things were not looking good, and the smell was very strong in our bedroom. And this room is next to the room from the apartment next door. Imagine an L in your mind. Our bedroom was sharing the same wall as the next apartment. I don't know why, but I immediately called the cops. They were there in about 15 minutes, and they entered the apartment next door. The policeman came out yelling that 2 dead bodies were inside. I was in shock. In such a busy neighborhood, how could this happen? A building with just one entrance, high walls, 5 security guards, and many, many cameras. How could that have happened? If the house was locked from outside, did the murderer get away? I mean, so many questions. The cops asked me to sign an affidavit as I was the witness. The first to report the crime, that is. Well, now my questions. What was it that we were experiencing in our apartment? As I've mentioned, I've had previous experiences with the paranormal. Is it somehow the same thing? My hunch says yes, but my mind doesn't want to believe that. Why me? Why was my family targeted, or at least alerted? Is it safe for me to stay in this house? I haven't experienced much fear in the last couple of days, but sometimes I feel someone is watching me, especially in the bedroom. It gives me and my wife a very eerie feeling. Anyway, police nabbed the guy who had planned the murder, but I heard he's denying everything. Nevertheless, it's not my case to figure out who's responsible for the murders, but I am still worried for my family. Was the spirit thing trying to communicate to me, to tell me something was wrong next door? So many questions, and very little answers. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you enjoyed it. If you care to, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and of course, leave a comment below. I respond to everything. If you have a true scary story you'd like to hear narrated, send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Also, if you're so inclined and would like to support this channel, become a patron. All patrons get early access to content, and there's going to be some other perks there available as well. There is information for you to sign up for as little as $1 a month in the description below. Follow me on social media for updates to the channel. All of the links for that are also below. And until next time, everyone, be excellent to each other. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.